I think I'll just start soon, more or less, because people might be walking in. It's about lunchtime. Rijn is getting me some water. But I thought I have a lot to share, hopefully, and use the time as best as possible. At any point, if you would like to come in or comment or ask things, you're very welcome to do so. The subject of my lecture is, the title is here, Looking into the Abyss, what it means to live in the times we're living in today, and what art can contribute in this context. Nietzsche is the one from whom I got this title, Looking into the Abyss. He had this great insight that if you do this, if you dare to look across the cliff into the deepness, that also the abyss is looking back into you. So it has consequences if you dare to take this look deeper into our situation. This is the image that was also on the poster from a Finnish artist. To me, a kind of apocalyptic view of what the state of our world is or could become. A few words on the structure of my lecture. I start by talking about the sense of urgency, why I think this is an extremely urgent subject. Next I'll talk about psychic numbing and eco-psychology. And then about art and the ecological crisis. So to start off with the situation we find ourselves in. This is a quote I picked up a few days ago from George Monbiot. If the news that in the past 40 years the world has lost over 50% of its vertebrate wildlife, mammals, birds, reptiles, amphibians, fish, fails to tell us there is something wrong with the way we live, it's hard to imagine what could. So it might take some time to swallow this, that we've lost 50% of vertebrate wildlife in just the course of 40 years. Some people have argued that what we are actually experiencing now, that we're at the beginning of what's called the Anthropocene, the era in which the human beings have become the dominant influence on the environment. This image from NASA, all the light sources. Our impact on the world, on the planet is tremendous. At some point in the, I think it was in the late 70s, early 80s, James Lovelock coined the Gaia hypothesis. The idea was that he regarded the Earth as one big living organism, self-regulating. So that the climate, for example, and the currents of the oceans was self-regulating and making corrections to change. This very same man has become extremely worried about our situation and what climate change is doing to us. In the midst of 2006, he was termed Dr. Doom in Newsweek, because he was saying that the deserts will spread from the equator up north, even to Paris. That in the course of a few decades it would only be possible to live at the poles. And maybe some few people would be able to stand out and live there, maybe grow some food, but it's a rather dire prediction. Because of that, he has become a strong advocate for nuclear power in a way to buy time to find solutions. So people have called this scenario that there's only some people, some tribes maybe living at the poles, the Mad Max scenario of this science fiction film, that there's a scarcity of resources and that it's a war of all against all for limited resources. Stephen Harding of Schumacher College, he's a staff ecologist, had this quote: I think if you don't get depressed, you need to see a therapist. There's something wrong with you if you are not profoundly saddened or depressed by the state of things at the moment. You need help to work out why you are not depressed. And you see a lot of publications like this. This is from a guy from Australia 4 years ago, The Requiem for a Species. Reading this book caused several people to come into a depression, like Bruno Latour and Naomi Klein. I'll talk more about her later. but it is in a way very hard to take in what the state of the world is at the moment. And one response to this is, and we'll talk a bit more about this psychic numbing. Numbing is sort of that you become dull or insensitive. And someone said, we live in what you might call post-normal times, that everything is in flux, everything is different than how we have experienced things before. And the message that we get from public campaigns is that you can still act upon it, you can do something to change your life, you can control climate change. But this message has been around for some years, and this is an interesting graph, which is worth studying a bit more. This was a question asked to people in Norway. How worried are you about the greenhouse effect in climate change? They started measuring in 1989 to 2009, and the blue is the people who worry a lot. So actually, despite all the information, despite all the campaigns, less and less people are worrying about it. So information apparently is not the problem. A philosopher from Germany, Gunther Anders, talked about the failure of our imagination, and about the split between what is technically feasible and what we are capable of imagining. So we can make a lot of things, but really grasp our impact is very difficult. He talked about superliminal sensations. You have subliminal sensations, for example, the touch of the skin, that there's a certain point that you don't feel the touch anymore. It's so small, the sensation. But superliminal sensations are things that are in a way too big, that you cannot take them in because they are too big. He would give the example of a bomber pilot not being able to take in what the effect of the bomb would be on the people that were bombed. That our imagination doesn't get it. He said already in '56, we are blind to the apocalypse. The image that sort of captures this is that this is a metaphor that has been used often, that if you would put a candle under this container of water and start heating the frog will not notice the slow change of temperature, and there will not be one moment at which the frog will jump out of the container. Whereas if there would be an immediate change of temperature, he would, for panic, jump out. And many people compare this to our situation, that things are changing very slowly, but not dramatically. So we're a bit like this frog, not knowing what is changing around us. And psychologists have termed this, in a way, cognitive dissonance, which means that the mental stress or discomfort experienced by an individual holds two or more contradictory beliefs, ideas, or values at the same time. So it's a way in which what you know about the world in a way contradicts about what you feel about what other ways you've come to understand the world. There is a dissonance, there is a sort of split. And psychiatrist Robert J. Lifton worked a lot with studying the survivors of the atomic bombs in Japan. He talks about that we put a curtain over our sensory organs. We get too many stimuli. We are in a way living a double life. That on the one hand we know all this, we get all the information, but we don't act upon it. He talked especially about the effect of nuclear bombs, but now he's also talking about climate change effects. And the curious thing is that there is actually maybe a survival value in this psychic numbing and closing yourself off to too much negative information. Because if you would really be able to take all this negative information in, you would go insane. So to some extent we all practice this psychic numbing, this cognitive dissonance, just to be able to make a living or to continue living in any meaningful way. But in a way, we find ourselves trapped in this situation of this fairy tale of Baron Munchausen, who tries to pull himself from the swamp by pulling his own hair. I would like to talk a bit more about eco-psychology. Eco-psychology is bringing together ecology, the science of ecology, and psychology. It's about taking psychology out of the spaces like this, contained within 4 rooms, 4 walls, and to try to perceive the human being, the human body, human existence as part of a larger whole, where the larger ecology has its impact on us in profound ways. Psychology says that climate change is like the tip of the iceberg visible to the human eye, while just beneath the surface of our collective consciousness, a far greater crisis is playing out. So a lot of attention goes to the tip, to the climate change, but there's something deeper going on that we have a hard time grasping. Deeper crisis. One eco-psychologist is Joanna Macy. It's maybe a bit hard to read. I'll try to read it for you. She said the most remarkable feature of the historical moment on Earth is not that we are on the way to destroying the world. We've been actually doing that for quite a while. It is that we are beginning to wake up as from a collective of a millennia-long sleep. A whole new relationship to our world, to ourselves and to each other is what eco-psychologists like Joanna Macy are arguing is that we, despite in contrast to sort of numbing ourselves to this crisis, that we step right into it. We go through the despair and try to see where that brings us. A bit about conceptualizations of the self. We'll talk about 3 different forms of how you can look upon the self, the ego, in our world. The balanced self, which is you might say a normal state, then the closed self and the ecological self, which I put with a capital S, which is sort of larger than the ordinary self. So if we start with the balanced self, there's sort of the self in the core, and then there are these layers of interactions where we sort of engage, we communicate with the larger ecological system around us. That are sort of semi-permeable, that our body doesn't stop with the skin, but we are constantly with our breathing, with our touching, in interaction with the world. Then the closed self is sort of shrinking. It's the outside pressures, the news of negative information, for example about climate change, is coming from all directions, and so that we shrink, we pull ourselves together and we make a protective barrier to sort of protect the core. So we in effect become a small self. Or this image of Robert J. Lifton, that we put a curtain over our sensory organs. The ecological self is about expanding the self, that we develop a wider self, which has a much more active, ongoing exchange with the wider environment, so that we're in a way living a state where we don't conceive of ourselves as just limited to the body and the skin that we're in, but that the way we are doing, the way we are living, is very much dependent on how we engage with the larger ecosystem. So it's opening up, widening the self, identifying with the rest of the non-human nature. So how do we make sense of climate change? This is Bill McKibben, who wrote already in the end of the 80s this remarkable book, The End of Nature, where he predicted more or less the effects of climate change and global warming. In the mid-80s, he wrote a text where he said, what the warming world needs now is art, sweet art. But where are the books, the poems, the plays, the goddamn operas? Actually, it was not in the 80s, it was sometime around 2004 or 5. And I want to talk a bit more about this, about what art can contribute, given this state we're in. One thing important about art is, I think, to sort of move art away from the idea that art is only in the galleries, only some gifted people are able to make art, to contribute to artistic processes, and only the elite is able to grasp it. There's something about the artistic expression that is irreducible, that you cannot sort of put in another idiom or other language. Like for these kids doing a theater play imitating bird movement. American dancer Isadora Duncan said about her art many decades ago, if I could tell you what it meant, there would be no point in dancing it. This means that you jump a level. There's one level, for example, like me talking about a certain subject on an intellectual, logical, rational way. The other level is the artistic expression that maybe is not something is expressed that could not be expressed in the way I am doing, for example, right now. Another way to sort of phrase this is to see the difference between what a scientist asks. He would ask, what is it? And an artist would ask also, what is it? But then adds, and what is it to me? So this is, I think, critical that from an artistic perspective, the E, the me, the I, is always involved. It's not putting yourself at a distance from the world, but it's directly trying to relate how it makes sense and how it affects yourself. And then I want to talk about 3 ways of looking at artistic practice. First, seeing art as our antennae to the world. Second, art and direct experience through the senses. Third and last, art and living with uncertainty. So first, art as our antenna to the world. So I think in many ways artists, maybe a bit earlier than others, trying to sort of make sense, trying to figure out what is about to happen. Because of a certain sensitivity, a certain openness to the world, they often come out with artworks which sort of try to grasp what is maybe about to happen, what the process we're in, without necessarily being able to put it in words or in any more extensive documents. For example, this artwork by Mark Dion sort of suggests to me that because of the rapid change of climate and the moving of the zones from the south up north towards the poles, that in a way wilderness has to migrate with the change of ecozones. But the problem, of course, is if there is time enough for species to adapt to these changes. An interesting project of sort of is expressed to me of this idea of artists as the antenna to the world. This project by Yves Mosher from New York. It's called The High Water Line. I'll show you a little clip about it.
Sea level rise is one of the most certain effects of climate change. There's very little scientific uncertainty about that. It's going to happen.
I'm drawing a line based on the 10 feet above sea level line, which is a very commonly used climate change and scientific scenario line. And in order to find out where is that line on the street, since I work in New York City, I used a U.S. Geologic Survey topographic map and looked at where that line was and then translated it myself onto Google Maps so that I could see satellite imagery and understand which house. This is underwater and this is dry, but we're going to come around and go back up, so it would be like a rivulet of water. This would be underwater, this would be dry. So there'd be a little dry strip down the center of the road, and all of this would be water.
The striking statistic about the line that she's drawing is that flooding was once projected to occur there every 100 years, but now by 2020, flooding will occur there every 43 years. So already that's double. And then by 2050, every 19 years, and then by 2080, every 4 years. One of the things that's so great about Eve's project is that it's direct. It has a very immediate impact on people. That is, she is drawing a line that you can see. And therefore it helps people visualize climate change. It helps localize it, that is, it makes it felt as a real impact to people's lives as opposed to some remote phenomenon. The other thing about Eve's project is she's directly engaging people in the community. So she's out performing the line, and people come up to her and ask her what's going on, so she gets a chance to interface one-on-one with people. And it reaches diverse constituencies inherently because it goes to different neighborhoods, including neighborhoods that are traditionally underserved for the arts.
So, I'm just got it here, but this was a project that Eve developed in 2007, but then 5 years later, we had Hurricane Sandy come to New York, where the water almost came exactly to this 10-meter line that she projected, sort of waves coming into Manhattan. So in a way, sooner than expected, it was already her sort of prophetic work was sort of playing out. Another way of looking at art, the second way, is to look at art as the full opening of our senses, which actually is the meaning of the word aesthetics. Our senses open up and engage with the world. And there's, I think, an interesting relation between the words aesthetics and anesthetics. So in aesthetics you need to open up to be able to take in the information, the new from the world. So if you have your hand in a fist, you cannot receive. You have to open up, to be vulnerable, to be perceptive, in order to take in what the world has to give you. If you close yourself off, you don't allow yourself to get this information from the world, which is effectively what you do when an anesthetist gives you an injection to prepare you for an operation. It numbs the senses. So it starts with directly experiencing the world. And I think this is a little valued but very profound effect of artistic practice, that you, in a way, train your sensitivity, you train your openness to take in more of the minute and subtle impressions, sensations you might get from other species. This is a workshop that I facilitated. The participants formed their hands from clay with their eyes closed. And through that also became more sensitive to what actually the hand that you use all the time is about. A group working a bit along these lines is the Dark Mountain project from Scotland. It started about 5 years ago. It was basically started with two guys, Paul Kingsnorth and Douglas Dugald-Heim. And Paul Kingsnorth was at the board of The Ecologist, a magazine which was first to report about ecological problems. And I have this small video of where his colleague Dugald-Heim tells a bit about how they started as a movement. And it's interesting how, you heard soon, how he talks about also the failure of imagination.
A couple of years ago, Paul Kingsnorth, who was a deputy editor of The Ecologist for a number of years, and I started talking about how fed up we both were, both with the direction in which the environmental movement had gone in terms of framing everything as kind of problems that needed to be solved in order to create a sustainable version of life as we know it. And on the other hand, the failure of imagination on the part of the arts, and particularly English literature, to face the scale of the change that we're likely to live through in all kinds of directions. And out of those conversations came the Dark Mountain project, and just this manifesto, which is really the first draft of those ideas. It's sort of, here it is, it's raising a flag for those people who are working as writers or artists or thinkers, or just anybody who is concerned that somehow we're not having a proper public conversation about what it's going to mean to live through these changes and how we help each other do that. The thing.
So what the Dark Mountain group, it's not really a movement, but more maybe a phenomenon. What they do is they organize these so-called uncivilization festivals, full of storytelling and theater play. Very different ways of how other political movements would relate to issues like climate change or the other aspects of the ecological crisis that we are living through today. Trying to make meaning of it, and I think it's interesting, this life history, which was maybe a bit hard to hear, it's a bit the sound was but what he was telling in this short clip is that this Paul Kingsnorth went through a crisis, that he was working for first for Greenpeace and then for the Ecologist, and he was all the time telling people, we have to just roll up our sleeves and get going and start acting to save the earth. And he was coming into this sort of cognitive dissonance, that he was making this argument in his campaigns in one way, but on the other hand, the other part of his personality was not believing anymore that this was actually the proper thing to do, as if just with a few more extra pushes can turn the problem away. So then he asked himself, if I'm in a crisis, why should I be in the crisis alone? Maybe there are more people who have a similar crisis. That became the impetus, the start of the Dark Mountain movement. So it's a bit like, if you recall the idea of eco-psychology, that in this situation of despair, if you don't hide away from it, but you go right into it to see where that leads you. But he started publishing these books, there's now 4 I think, to which poets, writers, several people contribute. Again, very different from ordinary pamphlets of political movements. Because the basic idea is that we need new stories, the story of the idea of progress, that the best is yet to come, you just have to work harder and then it will be solved, isn't working anymore. And in the context of this opening of the senses, I think there's a remarkable story from the Oneida Indians in North America. They once had a problem many centuries ago that there was too little game in the area where they lived, so they decided to move the tribe to another area. They did it rather hastily, and they moved to an area where there was also wolf. And the wolf were trying to catch the same game as the Oneida Indians were getting. And then they thought maybe we have to do something about it, kill the wolf. But then luckily they decided not to do this. And they decided maybe it's wiser that if we make space for the wolf and move somewhere else. And because there's enough for us, but maybe we should not be so close to each other. From that they developed a practice which is who speaks for wolf. So they would ask somebody of the tribe to, whenever they would make major decisions, that he or she would speak up for what the wolf would think about the decision. So it's again this idea of the wider self or the ecological self, that you include other species, in this case the wolf, in the decisions that you are making. The same idea was voiced by Thich Nhat Hanh, the Zen teacher. He was once asked, what do we need most to save the world? His answer was, what we most need to do is to hear within us the sounds of the earth crying. This might sound rather poetic, but I think it relates to this idea of our ecology sort of expounding beyond the limits of our skin to include the wider world. To be sensitive in a way that the earth is crying. Arne Naess, the philosopher who died a few years ago, who coined the term deep ecology. Along similar lines, he said, much of our work has been to encourage people to do moral actions. That moral action is something that you do because of an ethical law or moral law, that what is the proper way to handle. For example, if you go out into the wilderness, the moral law would be to clean up the rubbish behind you. Usually a moral action goes with the finger. You should do like this, you should not do like that. He would argue that we should try to move to beautiful actions. Beautiful action is actually the same thing as the moral action, but it is the same action without the finger. So you perform the beautiful action because an inner voice tells you that this is the appropriate thing to do. So nobody needs to push you when you're in the wilderness to clean up your rubbish. You do it with joy because it comes from your inner voice. And for that it is a beautiful action. Which also relates to art, I think, to encourage beautiful actions. And now the last aspect of looking at art in this context is art and living this uncertainty. To me here a very meaningful quote is, it's not quite sure if Iceland said this, but anyhow, the significant problems we face cannot be solved at the same level of thinking we were at when we created them. So that means, what this implies that we need somehow to make a jump from one level to the other. If we just continue business as usual, we are inclined to make the same mistakes again and again. This is a part of a film I made with other people on Anthony Gormley, a British sculptor, where he talks about what art could contribute, and also this idea of facing the unknown.
It's a rather comforting thing to think that this temporary aggregate of mind and matter that constitutes a human, precious human being. You know, it's a bit like surfing, where we do it while we can, and then the wave goes back into the sea. Maybe that's an image of a Buddhist notion of incarnation, and that actually lives and forms the whole rising and disappearing of lives and forms is a kind of endless mystery. Eliot said, where is the knowledge we have lost? No, where is the understanding we have lost in knowledge? Knowledge suggests always defined quantities, and understanding suggests that you might not, that it's a process that is open-ended.
So, I don't know if it was audible all the way to the back, but the key point he makes here to me is that there's a difference between knowledge and understanding. And understanding allows for not knowing, that it is open-ended, and that you're in a way able to handle or to live a bit longer with uncertainty. So again, to this question about being able to open up to the world or to lower our protective shields to protect yourself. How do we navigate this territory? And I think there's, from this eco-psychological point of view, there's a difference between surrendering and giving up. So often movements like, for example, the Dark Mountain are conceptualized in the media as that their argument is that they are giving up hope, that they just that it leads to sort of complete closure to the world. That it means the end of political action. But if you listen more carefully, I think that's not what they're arguing. They're not telling people to give up, but through the surrender, through going through the despair, that you come in another area, that you don't want to be fooled, you don't want to be blinded by false information, but you want to take in the bad news and still see what you can make out of that. And maybe one way to term this is cognitive resonance rather than the cognitive dissonance, the splitting of heart and mind. You try to sort of bring the two together, which is, for example, expressed in this idea of Martin Luther. He once is said to have said, even if I knew that tomorrow the world would go to pieces, I would still plant my apple tree. It's in a way an impossible thought. And the same idea is also expressed by Scott Fitzgerald, the American novelist. He said, the test of a first-rate intelligence is the ability to hold two opposed ideas in the mind at the same time and still retain the ability to function. One should, for example, be able to see that things are hopeless and yet be determined to make them otherwise. Which is again this paradox of two substances which apparently would exclude each other. And again, you saw his phrase before, Robert J. Lifton, the psychiatrist, he recently talked about what he calls the climate's swerve, which is the idea, swerve means to change direction suddenly, especially to avoid hitting someone or something. So his hope, in a way, is that the situation has become so dramatic that something might happen very swiftly, the way you try to, maybe in a car, try to avoid an accident. And if many people do that at the same time, make this swerve, make this shift, that could lead to directions that we at the present don't know yet, because it's a totally new situation. Which is also the argument in a book that has just been released by Naomi Klein. I remember I told about it that she got this deep depression reading this book of the Australian scientist about how the ecological crisis played out. And she's arguing in this book that this crisis we are living in today changes everything. Just to end, I'll show you a bit of her. This is from the trailer for her new book.
In December 2012, a complex systems scientist walked up to the podium at the American Geophysics Union to present a paper. It was titled, "Is Earth Fucked?" His answer was, yeah, pretty much. That's where the road we're on is taking us. But that has less to do with carbon than it does with capitalism. Our economic model is at war with life on Earth. We can't change the laws of nature, but we can change our broken economy. And that's why climate change isn't just a disaster. It's also our best chance to demand and build a better world.
Yeah, it's maybe a bit over-optimistic, but it's a bit, maybe this idea of hope against hope, or surrendering and not giving up. That she still, although she presents this bleak picture, she has gone through this depression, that she still wants to encourage people to, with their best hope, changing direction, to try to do something to face our situation and to find a way out. So this is basically what I had to say. And I'm curious at this lunch hour what you make of this. If you have any, does it resonate with what your own thinking is about your own feeling?
Yeah, I think this was beautiful, and I can easily share your feelings behind this, and no argument against what you are presenting. I really think this is.
Did you bring antidepressants? Will we have some at the door?
No, you don't need them. But you also have the ability to have the thoughtful things going on in our mind. Except some of us. Sorry for that.
Yeah, how?
Maybe just you seem to remain optimistic, and through the lecture one can feel you gently pushing to not quite giving in to the hopelessness. One Finnish thinker comes to mind, Pentti Linkola, who is perhaps a little bit extreme. Do you know him?
No.
So I think he associates with these kind of deep ecology people, but the main criticism towards him is a kind of misanthropy where he pretty much advocates